without further ado, I will share my screen amongst you one and all, and I would like to begin by immediately addressing the question that came forth last week. Can everyone see my screen okay, please?
Yes, we can. I can see it.
Very good.
Can see it. Good evening.
Thank you. Good evening and welcome.
Yes, we can see it.
Very good.
Yes, Chief.
Yes, we can see it.
The question that came up last week, or at least in relation to last week's question or lesson, reads as follows. It states, in lesson 2, you said that the books have been audited for reparations. I am a Black American and I don't support reparations. Although my husband has a different opinion about this, I don't think it is fair to have today's taxpayer pay for all that money the government is owing. The letter then goes on to say, America is not just Black and white. There are Hispanic, Chinese, Indian, Caribbean, and people from all over the world whose ancestors have nothing to do with slavery and stealing lands from Native people. All of these things happened hundreds of years ago, especially stealing the land from the natives. Would you not agree that it is better for us to focus on building better race relations instead of creating new tax burdens for everyone? That question came from Evelyn. Evelyn, I thank you very kindly for your inquiry. I've broken your statement down into 2 core questions. The first of which looks like this. Is it fair for the government of today to pay a legacy debt? And of course, the second part of the question is it better for us to focus on building better race relations instead of creating new tax burdens for everyone? Now, in addressing the questions, I would prefer to begin with a very pragmatic engagement of the second question. Is it better for us to focus on building better race relations instead of creating new tax burdens for everyone? Indeed, that second question has 2 components, one pertaining to race relations and the second pertaining to tax burdens. I would first of all concede that in the discussion last week, at no time did we per se speak about reparations. We spoke about accounting practices and auditing and balancing the books in according to would-be financial transactions or capital transactions that have transpired. With regards to, is it better for us to focus on building better race relations? The simple answer to that is that in doing a proper audit of the books and in paying debts that may be owed, that is the very best approach and strategy for race relations. And in particular, I will say that matter-of-factly as it pertains to Evelyn's country, which is the US of A, and I will illustrate that picking up on an example which was given last week. Now, one of the recent policies of the United States was a vision to build a wall, to build a very big wall between America and Mexico. Now, perhaps for newcomers to the US of A, that may sound like a totally legitimate suggestion and indeed plausible. However, for the indigenous North Americans, both those sitting on the USA side of that border and on the Mexican side of the border, the proposition is utterly preposterous. For those in Mexico, they would look to the north and seeing it as being a natural part of their indigenous lands, as would be the case for those indigenous communities in the US who are looking to the south. And so before a border could be drawn, a legitimate settlement must be in place with which indigenous peoples both on the northern part and the southern part of the border could mutually agree and say that they've conceded or given their land legitimately. And that brings us to the second half of the question as well as the first question. It says, instead of creating new tax burdens for everyone, and then it goes on at the first, is it fair for the government of today to pay a legacy debt? I want to address both of those questions with a simple example that is illustrated within the context of our course today on debt. And the example relates to what we call matching term of assets with term of liabilities. Now, suppose that your government decides to build a bridge. Of course, the bridge is an asset, and that asset will be a benefit to all taxpayers who use it. The government assesses the duration of the bridge or the lifespan of the bridge so that they could amortize the expenditure on the bridge. And of course, the government assesses that the bridge is strong enough to last for the next 60 years. And consequently, the bridge will benefit local taxpayers for at least 60 years. Consequently, the government issues a 60-year bond, which is a debt instrument in this case, a liability, so that the life of the bridge is matched with the expenditure of the asset. And consequently, in the example of the bridge, it states clearly the cost of the bridge is distributed to those taxpayers who benefit directly during the government expenditure on the bridge. Now, if we were to apply that to the United States of America, we would take the position of whether or not it is applicable for the government to pay a legacy debt. We would understand that the first constitution of today's USA was written on April 10th, 1606 by King James VI and First, and that constitution was entitled the First Charter of Virginia, which established Virginia as a colony for Great Britain. Now, following our example of the bridge and the legitimacy of the transaction, we would take the proposition as follows. Suppose the indigenous Americans agreed to sell the state of Virginia to King James for a market value of, in today's market dollars, what we will call $50 trillion, or its parity value back in 1606. What we would recognize is that, of course, the state of Virginia is an asset that would benefit taxpayers who live in it over many, many generations. Now, if King James had a developmental plan that would span the period of 400 years, which brings us from 1600 until today, what would be abundantly clear is that either the natives would issue King James a 400-year lease, at a rate of $125 billion per year, or King James would have to raise his money by issuing a 50 trillion bond over 400 years. Now, in the exact same way that it is legitimate and correct from an accounting and auditing perspective to amortize the life of the bridge over 60 years and amortize the expense of that bridge over 60 years. We don't say that, oh, the bridge was built 60 years ago. Why are we still paying for it today? We fully understand that the bridge has been amortized over a 60-year period. And that's the way legitimate assets are acquired and developed. And so the same holds true as it pertains to the colony of Virginia on the one hand, and the entire United States of America on the other hand. In order to improve, as Evelyn inquired, race relations between the US administration and its indigenous people, a legitimate transaction must occur where those natives have been adequately compensated. We stated clearly in our lesson last week that the law of commerce is blind to offices, it is blind to titles, it is blind to politics, and it is blind to religion. It weighs the equal trade of value for value, irrespective of the person or authority in the transaction. Whether they are rich or poor, powerful or weak, free or enslaved, those are not the issues when it comes to commerce and trade. The simple question is, was a legitimate transaction transpired between Great Britain and the indigenous people? And insofar as the answer is no, then the law of commerce dictates that we must insist that a legitimate settlement accrue, irrespective of the time and the period that has lapsed. In Africa, many people have heard discussions on something called blood diamonds. And indeed, the topic of blood diamonds has been very controversial because there is the view that those diamonds have been acquired illegitimately and that great blood has been spilled in the acquisition of those diamonds. And consequently, when we look at the relation between the US dollar and the indigenous people of the US, we recognize that from the law of commerce, the principle is the exact same. And we should not overlook that principle. And some people may say, well, we are villainizing people. But the fact of the matter is we are not creating villains. We are trying to rectify the errors that have occurred in the past so that we can move forward collectively and meaningfully into a transparent, prosperous, and mutually inclusive future. There is no villainization within the law of commerce. And so, having addressed Evelyn's question, without further ado, we move on to our lesson for today. Users of capital. There are three unique categories for users of capital. First, there are individual users. There are, of course, business users, and there are governments. When talking about individual users, generally, we recognize that individual users or private persons require capital for essential acquisitions, such as purchasing a home, such as purchasing their domestic consumer goods, such as automobiles and their appliances. The limitations that apply to these individual users in terms of gaining access to capital is that they are generally limited to debt. And the debt instrument for individual users tends to be personal loans, mortgage loans, and credit cards or charge accounts. Now, when individual users come up in a business context, we are not yet talking about the corporate individual. We are talking about a real individual. And by real individual, we mean a natural human being, a person of flesh, a person of blood, and a person who takes the breath of life. When two individuals combine together in any business transaction, this is what we call a partnership. And we are able to distinguish between partnerships and sole proprietorships within a business context. A sole proprietorship is very much a continuation of the private individual at home. He begins to maybe sell things from his home, or he opens a small shop, or he becomes a lawyer or an accountant. In all instances, he is working alone. And of course, while he may enjoy all the profits that he earns working alone, he is also liable for all losses and all debts. Generally, our discussion going forward will focus on securities, and sole proprietors do not issue financial securities to the public. Indeed, they are dependent on the same financial instruments that they had when acting as a private person. This does not change much when they enter their partnerships. When two or more individuals come together in business, this is called a partnership. Traditionally, and throughout history, all business activities were conducted by proprietors, either individually or in partnership. Individuals and partners are in competition amongst themselves. They're in competition with corporations, and they're also in competition with governments for the usage of capital. Everybody is trying to gain access to capital, and indeed, there's only a limited amount of capital available within the market. When we talk about a corporation, and indeed much of our conversation this evening will focus on corporations, they are not as transparent or as common sense as many people would like to imagine. Indeed, a corporation is, if you will, a legal fiction. It replicates the sovereignty of proprietors as individuals, and it also replicates the sovereignty of governments. It duplicates both governments and individuals in its pursuit of capital and in the usage of capital. In the statement here, it says, they are like the reflection in a mirror. They look like someone real, but are not. For those of you who know the legacy of Kentucky Fried Chicken, today everybody says KFC. But back in the 70s, nobody said KFC, everybody said Colonel Sanders. And when you were sitting in either Canada or America or somewhere else in the 70s where they had KFC, you spoke about Colonel Sanders and that you're going to have Colonel Sanders for dinner. Since his passing, his corporate identity lives on, so that we no longer necessarily associate the corporation with the man who created it. So during his lifetime, we knew Colonel Sanders, and in his passing, we know KFC. And so the corporation takes on a fictitious life and a fictitious identity unto itself that lives beyond its founders, beyond its shareholders, because its shares pass hands readily and easily, depending on the type of the structure, and even beyond many generations. As users of capital, corporations require massive amounts of capital to finance their day-to-day operations. At least that's what any good profit-seeking chief executive officer will tell you. They require capital for their inventories and for their accounts receivables. They require capital for the renewal of their plant equipment and maintenance. And they require capital for corporate diversification and expansion. Now, in theory, all of this is financed ideally via profits, or borrowed through intermediaries such as banks, and raised in security markets through the issuance of short-term money market paper, or medium to long-term money market paper, or the distribution of equity in the form of preferred and common shares. We said earlier that corporations mirror individuals and they mirror governments. Notwithstanding, individuals don't have access to the issuance of these types of financial securities, and consequently, it is a deception or a inaccurate statement to say that corporations completely mirror individuals, as they have acquired more power, more sovereignty, and more freedom than the individuals whom they seek to mirror. And as a government, the United States of America is itself amongst the oldest corporations in the world. We recognize that our governments are deep in debt. And we are compelled to ask the question, why are they so deep in debt? And the answer is twofold. There is a surface level answer that we've all become accustomed to hearing and giving as a response. And there is a much deeper answer, which I will try to address and illuminate this evening. Now, in the first instance, why do governments issue debt securities to the public market? It's quite simple. The argument is that the Minister of Finance creates the yearly government budget, which is an estimate of its annual revenues and expenses. And of course, this allows for a projection of a surplus or a deficit. Most governments have a deficit. And by deficit, we mean that the expenditures that our government bodies have exceed the revenues that they are able to generate vis-a-vis taxation. And of course, this is what causes them to borrow. So indeed, the argument is, and the logic is, that the government is borrowing money to service the needs of the people. The government is looking at all the needs of the people. It's looking at your educational needs, your medical needs. It's looking at your social infrastructure needs to ensure that you have water in your house, to ensure that you have electricity in your house. And based upon all of these needs that the government recognizes that you require, it is compelled to borrow money to meet the deficit of capital. The US government, as all governments or the majority of governments, finances its debt by issuing treasury bills. When we look at the top holdings of US treasury bills, we see that countries such as Japan and China have purchased $1 trillion each in US treasury bills. The United Kingdom, Ireland, combined $1 trillion, just about. Switzerland, 300 billion. Luxembourg, almost 300 billion. Cayman Islands, 250 billion. Brazil, 250 billion. Taiwan, almost 250 billion. And France, 250 billion. These are just the top 10 holdings of American treasury bills. And indeed, we see that the total treasury bills globally issued are $7 trillion. The United States has the largest external debt in the world for her small population. Certainly between Nigeria, South Africa, Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, indeed, between all 55 or 54 nations on continental Africa, their ability to borrow $7 trillion is literally and utterly impossible. And any nation considering doing that would find the value of their currency completely depleted, as was the case for Zimbabwe in the not so distant past. Now, in order to understand what we mean by treasury bills, I would like to take about 3 minutes to give a very short fresher up course on bonds in general and on fixed income securities in particular. And I will use a very traditional approach to explaining this. I know that some of you will find this very commonplace, but for those of you who are novice to finance, we will use a novice framework. Traditional fixed income securities are sold at par. And by par, we mean 100% of its value. So, for example, a bond, which is a debt instrument for the time being, is purchased for the value of 100 lumi. The bond matures in 12 months, and you are given back a value of 100 lumi. Now, we are going to suppose that on this fixed income security, there is interest. Let us say the rate of interest is 5%. And consequently, what you get as your return on investment is the interest. So we have an increase in par from 100 to 105, and that 5 is your return. If the bond is sold for 5,000 lumi, just so that we understand this with par, par is still 100%. So the face value of the financial instrument is always described at 100%. And this is this is contrasted to a discounted bond. So a discounted bond is a bond sold for a value less than par. For example, you purchase a bond at a value of 93 lumi. In this case, no interest is paid on the bond, And when the bond matures 1 year later, you of course get 7 lumi in return. So although no interest is paid, the investment or principal grows by 7 lumi, which is the return to the investor. And of course, bonds can also be sold for a value more than par, which is what we call a premium. And in this case, the return to the investor is the interest minus the premium paid. Now, coming back to our discussion on governments and indeed on debt. In our modern society, everyone is preoccupied with debt. Extremely high levels of government debt has caused concern all around the world. It's not just Africa. It's not just Europe. It's not just America. It's not just Asia. It is all around the world. And private individual debts are bringing households to absolute bankruptcy. And the magical question, indeed, the billion lumi question, is why? Why are our governments today in a form of debt that we've never seen before in ancient times, and ideally should never see again in the future? To understand the answer to this question, I want us to look at a short definition of what exactly is a government, so that we could recognize what change has occurred and where the transformation towards a debt society has begun. According to our Merriam-Webster, a government is the group of individuals that control and make decisions for a country, a state, etc. Fair enough. Well done, Merriam-Webster. According to our Black's Law Dictionary, a government is the regulation, restraint, supervision, or control which is exercised upon the individual members of an organized jural society by those invested with supreme political authority for the good and welfare of the body politic, or the act of exercising supreme political power or control. These are very lofty definitions. And for the layperson, it's difficult to comprehend in some ways what wants to be said there with regards to what is this thing called a government. Now, we looked at and considered how corporations can mirror individuals, considering, for example, the example we gave with Kentucky Fried Chicken. And now we have to come to an understanding of how corporations have learned to mirror governments. In our most ancient traditions, and you all know that I like to go back to the fundamentals. In our most ancient traditions, whether we start off with Adam and his relation with his creator, or we move up to any period, any dynasty over counted time, immemorial. We have a recognition of one common pattern, and that is kingly governments. And at that time, it was clear that ancient governments were headed by a sovereign king, or at least somebody appointed by the king. This was because the king functioned as a mediator between his people and God, which means that somewhere in the relationship or the understanding of a state and of a government, the creator had a role to play. And of course, the king and the people were seen as one, and consequently, the king administered the economy in the interest of the people. Now, some people may see this definition as archaic. And indeed, the last person to profess such a definition was indeed the same one who signed the Charter of Virginia, our good friend, King James. King James was perhaps the last European monarch to fully embrace the ancient Egyptian tradition of the divine right of kings. Indeed, James said, the state of James said, the state of monarchy is the supremest thing upon earth. For kings are not only God's lieutenants upon earth and sit upon God's throne, but even by God himself, they are called gods. And so, right up until his death in 1625, we are to understand that kings saw themselves as being an extension of God, and indeed God's lieutenant on earth. And for all intents and purposes, that concept still very discreetly exists within the UK, where the Queen of England is both the head of state as well as the supreme governor for the Church of England. Now, how does this relate to and pertain to corporations imitating governments? Insofar as a king was the mediator between his people and God, certainly a definition like this speaks nothing towards a spiritual communion amongst a people and in conjunction with their creator. And so there has indeed been a change in terms of how we understand ourselves, how we understand our governments, and how we as a people relate to our creators. Now, for all intents and purposes, when kings die, the wealth of the kingdom, the lands, and the people live on. The only way for a corporation to die is when capital has been exhausted and they go bankrupt. I'm going to repeat that statement again because the nuance is quite important when we consider corporations mirroring governments. The only way corporations die is when their capital has been exhausted and they go bankrupt. Now, using the United States of America as an example of the oldest corporation or corporate government in the world, we see that in 1606 and 1622, King James issued charters allowing British merchants to take illegal possession of the lands known today as the USA and Canada. The colony of Virginia was created as a crown corporation. When kings expand, their expansion is done in the form of a crown body, a crown corporation, and consequently the colony of Virginia was a crown corporation. When the good people of America declared independence in 1776, declaring their sovereignty or independence from the king, what they really did was express their desire to the king for independence. Now, in the story, of course, they expressed that desire through military warfare, etc. But the fact of the matter is, true independence was not given until the Paris Treaty of 1783, in which the king gave royal assent to the independence of the American corporation. So with that treaty and with that royal assent, we notice that there was not a new king that was established in America. The royal assent of sovereignty, or rather independence, was given to a charter, if you will, to a corporate entity. Now, if we consider what America did with its declaration of independence, and we consider what our great leaders of the continent did, what Kwame Nkrumah did in 1957, the simple fact of the matter is our people desired independence. Our people aspired for freedom. And consequently, from 1957 onwards, the journey for independence swept across Africa. However, there's an important nuance. You see, rather than returning the lands to the indigenous kingdoms, our people established corporate states of governance in duplication of the American model. Now, once you establish a corporation, let us not be deceived by any stretch of the imagination. The only objective of a corporation is to generate profits for its shareholders. Corporations that fail to generate profits eventually go bankrupt and die. And when those corporations are governments, they end up leaving the people enslaved to the pursuit of profits within an already dead system of governance. Now, these economic principles, which many of us treat as being new concepts and ideas, are actually quite old. Not only are they old, but in fact, they're ancient. I would like to take a moment to contextualize 5 regimes of governance so that we as a people, not only in continental Africa, but the global human family, can understand where we are in history as it relates to governance and the relation between governments and people. And to illustrate the example, I would like to draw from one of my dear ancient friends. I think it's no secret. In fact, everybody who knows me knows that I'm an avid philosopher as well as an economist and financial engineer. So let me draw from the wisdom of one of our old friends. 2,400 years ago, Plato defined very clearly 5 regimes of governance. And of course, he started off with the best framework and worked his way down to what was regarded at that time the very worst framework or regime of governance. And of course, at the best framework, there was what he called the aristocracy in its most ancient sense. It consisted of a philosopher king who took the wealth and distributed it amongst all of the people. And all of the people found themselves within a natural division of labor. And because all the people were consolidated together beneath their creator, God, they all deemed themselves as being equals as such. And then, of course, after the aristocracy, Plato defines something that he calls timocracy. Now, a timocracy develops many generations after aristocracy. And it is the remnant children of the philosopher king. However, amongst these children, wealth is still common to all of them, but as a consequence of their own spiritual decay, they begin to practice both money making and land acquisitions. And indeed, rather than holding the land in common to all people, they transform the land and houses into private property. And when that process begins, that is what we call the beginning, or at least what our old friend there, Plato, calls the beginning of theft and conflict and war. Because now there's private property, and people begin to compare themselves one amongst another. And of course, once this economic condition settles in, the timocracy deteriorates and becomes what Plato calls the oligarchy. Now, within an oligarchy, people themselves become valued by their land possessions. The consequence is that the rich rule, while the poor have absolutely no share in ruling. And of course, these two groups end up existing side by side within the same kingdom, as it were. And side by side, you have one society for the poor and another society for the rich. And the rich keep exploiting and oppressing the poor, but both of them are complete lovers of money. And the poor become envious of the rich. And through the envy that the poor have towards their rich rulers, they create a revolution. And they create that revolution in the name of democracy. And so consequently, democracy is born of war or revolution of poor against oligarchs. And nowhere is this articulated better than the US Declaration of Independence. The poor, in their pursuit for democracy, achieve freedom to speak. Indeed, their highest aspiration is to do as they please. In this regard, their city becomes like a coat of many colors. After having been oppressed, after having been poor for so long, freedom becomes their only objective. From a political agenda, the city or the kingdom has no real agenda. Its only agenda is more freedom. And the leaders only need to stand on a platform and speak about freedom and make promises about freedom and equality, but in fact, have absolutely no concrete agenda. At least that was Plato's interpretation of democracy, written some 2,400 years ago, and based upon his observations of the previous democracies that had existed throughout ancient times. So these vocabularies are no new things. These vocabularies are no new things. Democracy is no new aspiration. After seeing democracy as being one of the very worst types of social structures, it goes on to say that democracy inevitably leads to tyranny. And of course, the tyrant is born of conflict in an effort to bring order back from democracy. Indeed, many people were in a state of shock and awe by some of the very, let me say, lucid statements made by the former president of the United States. Some people perceived him as being a tyrant. And for scholars of political science, political history, economics, they found that America was very much fulfilling the description within Plato's chapter 8 of the Republic. Now, one of the cornerstone topics and statements that Plato makes about democracy, which speaks very much to our condition today, all of us can relate to as it reads as follows. He says, a father accustoms himself to behave like a child and fears his sons, while the son behaves like a father, feeling neither shame nor fear in front of his parents in order to be free. A resident alien or a foreign visitor is made equal to a citizen, and he is their equal. Now, in the case of America. And let me say more directly, in the case of Africa, where we have our investment partners from China coming to claim assets, for example, in Kenya, in exchange for debt, coming to claim assets in Zambia in exchange for debt, coming to claim assets throughout the entire continent from those countries that are indebted. And by assets, I mean airports. I mean major seaports and other essential assets that belong to the people. What we see is the consequence of governments that are functioning like corporations. Now, because a corporation will die if it goes bankrupt, what it begins to do is take out more and more debt. It borrows money from anywhere and everywhere to stay alive. And indeed, if it's not capable of generating a profit, then debt itself becomes the modus operandi of the corporation or of the government, until one day its creditors come and it says, we are taking everything, and the corporation is effectively dead. I presented to you Plato's 5 regimes because it speaks very intimately to the current circumstances facing the African family on the one hand, but indeed the world on the other hand, as not only Africa ran to create corporate states, but Europe, when it got rid of its traditional leadership, also created corporate states. Now, as we move forward as a people, having made the experiences that we made, and knowing the wisdom that we ought to know. I mean, after all, Plato's writings are 2,400 years old. And if you read his writings on democracy, you will see that they are far more comprehensive than most modern commenters on democracy. And so, having taken his wisdom from the wisdom of the Egyptians, whom he borrowed much of his examples from, who took their wisdom from the rest of the continent, we must be able to learn from the ancients to understand where we are in this present hour, and to understand the implications of financial instruments such as debt, which can be used to indeed build a nation when properly structured, but can also be used to utterly and completely destroy a nation. And so, in that note, in that light, and in that spirit, I conclude our lesson today. We looked briefly at the concepts of individuals, businesses, and corporations as users of capital. And we looked briefly at these agents, and in particular at governments, as it relates to debt instruments. And we considered how corporations mimic private individuals, how corporations mimic governments, and the reality that corporations today are always talking about all the profits that they are making. But our private people and our governments are swailing in poverty. And so we must look carefully at these topics, and we will going forward. Do we have any questions before we close the lesson for the night? I see a hand up from Holani Kubeka.
Hi, Chief, and hi, everybody.
Greetings.
Yes, yes. Before I actually make a question, just a reminder, last week I made a proposal and you charged me to write it down. So I'm waiting for the communication details or emails where I can send that proposal, and I'll be happy to do so quickly.
Thank you.
Okay, but the question I have today, firstly, let me commend these classes because we are getting a lot of eye-opening lessons and perspective on how we need to look at things instead of, because there are a lot of scams that are happening in the form of us understanding the Western way. And I know everybody, like all Africans, are not happy with how things are because they are not happening in our favor, and they are not happening in a way that we can. Any other person that is actually leading this movement is how can we help and how can we actually fast track this reversal of these injustices. Now, the question is based on practical solutions, because if I listen carefully to your teachings, you have the fundamentals and you have the basic understanding of what now unitedly, even if it's the few of us, even if it's the handful of us, but where can we start to actually correct these injustices? Because they continuously happen. We are talking about issues of other, let me just not say other, but China taking over strategic assets of our kingdoms, and we are watching as if there's nothing we can do, when in contrary, there is a lot that we can do, but practically, what can we do? Thank you, Chief.
Thank you very much both for your comment and for your question. Although I didn't hear all that you said, I did catch the vast majority of it, and I will try to address it as directly as possible in this particular forum to the best of my ability, which is to say, first and foremost, if we don't understand the full dynamics that are surrounding us and the fundamental rights that a people have within any given moment, what you do not know, you cannot take action upon. And so I hate to sound like someone else's broken record in making the statement that first and foremost, we need to inform ourselves. As a people, we need to understand what relation shall we have with our corporate governments. We need to be able to articulate what expectations we have of our governments when we see our governments taking dictates from foreign corporations, such as the IMF, such as the World Bank, such as the United Nations. We have to ask, and not only ask, but be prepared to make these topics of policy. What is our vested interest in certain types of relations? What is Africa's vested interest in the United Nations when Africa does not have a seat on the Security Council? How can you sit in an organization that is supposed to be an organization of equals, and at the same time, you have no equality? And in knowing these things, which we all know, we must be prepared to make decisive decisions. We don't request it of our leaders. Our leaders are there to do what? They're there to represent us. That's why we created something called democracy in the first place. We wanted to be represented. They're not there to, as corporate agents, one could say they're there to represent the shareholders. But if we're not the shareholders, then who are? And so, again, not to sound like a broken record, but in this particular forum, we state very clearly that education is the first stronghold, and to put a framework with which that education becomes part of our policy, it becomes part of our day-to-day decisions. Many people are always asking me, how do we convert Lumi into US dollar? Now, on the one hand, we are and will do everything necessary to facilitate that conversion. But on the other hand, when it comes to intra-African trade and developing the African economy, the worst thing that you could ever want to do is convert Lumi into US dollar, because US dollar is a fiat. It's a dead currency. It has no intrinsic value. Why would I want my valuable currency converted into a dead currency? But so long as we're not able to take the wisdom that we have and apply it matter-of-factly to our commerce, to our economy, to our households, and to our policies at government, then we walk around as philosophers, people with grand opinions, but neither the courage nor the audacity to take the actions necessary so that we can achieve the outcomes that we want to achieve. And in the context of this forum, as a forum for learning, I wouldn't venture further into that question. Thank you so kindly. I see the hand of Labina Keel. Good evening.
His Royal Highness, greetings.
Greetings.
I'm listening carefully to what you are teaching us today. This class it's a bit scary for me, I must say, especially the last part when you say, then the predators come and say, we are taking everything. And we see these things happening. So I know when you started, initially you said, these are just masterclass. So, but my mind is a mind of solving problems. I get frustrated when I can solve a problem. So in this,
I apologize, Lavina. I don't know if it is the case for everyone else, but I'm actually not hearing
question
you.
is,
Unfortunately,
okay, can you hear me?
I never heard anything that you've said. I apologize. I don't know if it's just me or if it was the case for everybody, but on my side, you're completely non-intelligible hearing.
Okay, can you hear me now?
I do hear you now.
Okay.
No, I apologize, Lavina.
I was saying,
A stretched out sentence, it breaks up. I'm not hearing you.
today's class me is like
Lavina, my apologies. My apologies. Can I ask you to maybe put your question in the chat? I haven't looked in the chat, but maybe if you could put your question in the chat, then I can at least read it and address it, because I'm not hearing anything that you say. My apologies for that. I see another hand up from our good sir Konata Bellucci.
Hotep, my brother, your Royal Highness, Chief Marco. Hotep, all the kings and queens, ministers, ambassadors, vice prime ministers. All right, I have a simple question, my brother. First, I must say I commend you on the task. What you have taken up is a mammoth task. But if you weren't ready for the task, you wouldn't be in that position you are in. So that's the first thing. The question is simple. Are you aware of the quantum financial system? That is basically tied into moving away from a fiat system to the precious metals. Also, are you aware of Nesara and Gesara?
When you say, am I aware? I mean, obviously that you're asking the question of my awareness, and so are you asking, am I involved in these things? I'm not. Maybe
And
raise your question differently.
Not just aware of it, but what is the connection of the Lumi currency in tandem with the quantum financial system and Nesara and Gesara?
From a institutional perspective, we have no correlation and no relation financially or otherwise, aside from those bodies and peoples who represent the diaspora. So whatever other movements are going on, and not to say that we don't hear about those activities, but they are not part of our immediate mandate, as our focus is financial inclusion for the global African family and putting a framework in place by which that can be achieved. So while there are other movements which have nuanced frameworks that may seem parallel to ours, insofar as the outcome and the intention of those frameworks are not succinct or at par with what we are trying to achieve for our people, then we don't even necessarily give it a second look. But perhaps you have a question or a comment with which you feel that we should consider that otherwise.
Well, basically because of my involvement prior to coming into SWORD Eco 6, I was involved with being aware of the quantum financial system, where it spoke about global currency reset, which basically would be in the process now, tied into moving away from a fiat currency where they just print money to money being tied to either gold or precious metal, right? So that is the reason why I asked you that question, because it is basically in sync with what is happening regarding with the Lumi.
Thank you very much for the question and for the comment. However, I have a slightly nuanced perspective to that, which I'll only take 30 seconds to express very directly. As far as I'm concerned, Lumi is the global currency. The international community has no assets. And all of the assets that they are trying to acquire from our motherland. And so insofar as people are having a conversation that sounds like it is the same topic, one must ask, yes, but where do you plan on getting that from? So if you are sitting in Europe or you are sitting in America and you are talking about building a great new currency that is backed by our ancestral resources, I can assure you that there will be difficulties going forward, because unless Africa has full and complete inclusion and decision-making power and authority over all things pertaining to her resources going forward, none of those things can nor will be possible. They're what I call pipe dreams. And that's why when I consider some of those aspirations, I like to make it very clear. The Lumi is in place. It is the official currency of Africa's 6th region. If you want to know where Europe is, well, it's located in the 6th region. If you want to know where America is, it's located in the 6th region. If you want to know where Asia is, it is located in the 6th region. And so for all of those powers that want to engage our great motherland in the future, they will be obliged to use the currency of the 6th region so that they can engage the motherland. Thank you very much for your question.
Thank you, my brother.
Hotep.
Hotep.
If there are no further questions or comments, then I would thank you all for your attendance this evening. I bid you peace, blessings, and ancestral powers until we see ourselves again next week. Madasi, thank you. Blessings all. Good night.
Blessings.